Janie saw her life like a great tree in leaf with the things suffered, things enjoyed, things done and undone. Dawn and doom was in the branches. Trees appear constantly throughout Their Eyes Were Watching God, making this repeating symbol a motif. Janie longs to be a pear tree, to be any tree in bloom, wanting sweet things and passion in both her life and her relationships. Despite this desire, though, Janie's first two marriages yield little sweetness, resembling the withered trees of winter. But still, winter turns to spring, and the promise of buds, leaves, and flowers lurk in these barren branches. A similar revitalization waits for Janie if she is courageous enough to take it. At its core, Their Eyes Were Watching God is a quest for self-fulfillment, to live fully, and to reach the horizon of experience. So join me as we accompany Zora Neale Hurston and Janie Mae Crawford on their journeys to find their place in the world. Zora Neale Hurston is writing during two distinct periods of American literature, the Modernist movement and the Harlem Renaissance. And the overall goal of modernism was to be different than any artistic movement that had come before. It was a radical revolution in form, structure, content, topic, expression, and other artistic elements. And this was a movement that was not just happening in America, but was also happening in Europe as well at the same time. And there's some debate over when the modernist period began. For the most part, many scholars suggest it's around 1890-ish at the earliest, near the turn of the century, and ending either at the beginning or end of World War II. And World War I played a great influence on the modernists. As a result of that global catastrophe and all the destruction that it wrought on the world and its people, there was a questioning of old ways of doing things in all aspects of life, but especially in art. And there was kind of a lack of faith in the old social structures that had used to maintain order, since we saw so much chaos and destruction occur in World War I. So these artists really began to question the stability of human society and civilization. And the period before the modernist period, which was the Victorian era, had been characterized by order and stability and a sense of unity. But the modernist period was full of doubt and a sense of nihilistic pessimism. So this kind of belief that nothing mattered and that there wasn't kind of a deeper meaning to things in life. So the modernists are kind of downers. As a result, artists turned away from the traditional structures of their fields to recreate what art meant. It's characterized by experimentation and innovation in technique and style. We see an increased focus on the individual and the everyday individual's response to society, and how that individual fits into a larger society. We also see more representations of the uncertain nature of reality, again, as modernists sort of questioned how we even perceive the world around us. In novels, we often saw a stream of consciousness, so kind of that idea of sort of writing like what you hear in your head. There was more focus on the inner minds of characters, since this is also a period where Sigmund Freud is doing a lot of his work, and so art is kind of influenced by some of his findings. And symbolism, fragmented reality, disjointed periods of time are all other features of modernist texts as well. Modernist artists also often deal more frankly with sexuality, desire, the body, passion, anything kind of physical, which used to be very taboo, especially in the Victorian era. There also is some progress in the portrayal of female characters in a more complex and nuanced light, but many male authors of the modernist era still miss the mark and kind of have these women who fall into those traditional gender expectations or kind of serve as a stepping stone for the male character to further develop. So again, we're seeing some progress and focus on women's subjectivity from male writers. Luckily, we are also getting more female writers published and read, so we do kind of have someone to counteract these narratives that men are writing, but for the most part, the literary market is still dominated by male writers. The second literary period Zora Neale Hurston is associated with is the Harlem Renaissance, which occurred from roughly 1917 to about 1935. And the word Renaissance, comes from the Italian Renaissance and means rebirth or reawakening. And it's important to note that the Great Depression began during the Harlem Renaissance in about 1929, and then ended, of course, 4 years after the period ended with the beginning of World War II. And the Harlem Renaissance is occurring at the same time as the modernist movement, so we see a lot of overlap between these two artistic eras. And the Harlem Renaissance is really characterized by an outpouring of cultural, social, and artistic creation from African Americans in the Harlem neighborhood of New York. So black artists who were working with all different types of media, as well as black scholars, flocked to the city, many of them leaving the oppression and violence of the southern states. And the Renaissance was not only occurring in New York, but Harlem was kind of the epicenter of this activity and sort of the beginning of this movement. So the Harlem Renaissance also ignited racial pride, which partially resulted from the New Negro movement, which demanded socio-political equality for African Americans. It also sought to fight against and undo the white stereotypes of blacks and articulate an American identity for blacks. Additionally, there's an increased interest in the art and culture of Africa as a source of both pride and artistic heritage. And we see many authors and artists kind of dealing with these topics and structures and sometimes these ideas from African folklore or other African traditions. So authors like Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as Ralph Ellison and Countee Cullen are part of this movement, as well as Zora Neale Hurston. In terms of music, jazz and the blues played a major role in the Harlem Renaissance. As a result of going to jazz clubs, we see an increased interaction between white people and black people, especially in these clubs and speakeasies. Unfortunately, though, this does not destroy the Jim Crow barriers that separated the races until the 1960s and still linger on in our society today. And the Renaissance was not a unified movement, which is true of many literary periods as well as the modernist era, where there's kind of many different authors and artists doing very different things, but kind of coming together under some of these same concepts or exhibiting some of these same concepts in their work. There was much debate, though, in the Harlem Renaissance about how best to forge this national identity for African Americans, and very much differing viewpoints between artists. And unfortunately, though, the onset of the Great Depression led to unemployment and crime in Harlem, and the Harlem Riot of 1935 effectively ended the movement. So now it's time to talk about the woman herself, Zora Neale Hurston, who was born in 1891 and died in 1960. Zora grew up in Eatonville, Florida, which was an all-black town and one of the major settings in Their Eyes Were Watching God. Zora and her Baptist preacher father did not get along very well. They had a very contentious relationship. Luckily, she and her mother, though, were very close. Zora had 7 siblings, but unfortunately her mother died when Hurston was in her preteens, leaving her with little support at home, especially because her father quickly remarried a younger woman who Zora did not get along with either. And as a result, her relationship with her father further deteriorated. Growing up in an all-black town, Zora was mostly shielded from racism and prejudice for most of her early life. As a result of living in Eatonville, Hurston saw African Americans in positions of power and being successful. In 1917, at the age of 26, she arrived in Baltimore without a high school diploma. In order to get free schooling, she took off 10 years from her age, saying she'd been born in 1901. She never added those years back on. So after getting her high school diploma, she eventually graduates from Howard University, a historically black college in D.C., and then moves to Harlem to become a writer. And people who knew her say that she was witty, charming, and charismatic, and would entertain people with her tales of Eatonville life. She supposedly was the life of the party and had one of those warm personalities that just really drew you in. She later went to Barnard College for graduate study, where she studied anthropology and black folklore and traditions. She was also known as a storyteller and performer, which gave her both an academic and personal interest in oral narrative. So oftentimes folklore and traditional storytelling is spoken rather than written down. And so we see that Hurston's work has a lot of kind of this oral quality to it, and her work is really famous for capturing the voices of the people she writes about. She studied the oral traditions of Eatonville on a scholarship after she graduated, and when that funding ran out, she ended up getting an elderly white woman as a patron, Mrs. R. Osgood Mason. And Hurston, like several other artists of the Harlem Renaissance, had to deal with the fact that white people were the funders, and in many cases audiences of their work. This often put constraints on their ability to fully express their tales of black identity, as again, they had to keep in mind that they were writing for mostly of a white audience. Hurston did not believe in portraying black people as only virtuous. She wanted to portray them as they were in their full complexity, both good and bad. And she disagreed with some male artists of the Harlem Renaissance who really strongly believed in portraying idealized representations of African Americans in their work. And Hurston kind of became a writer during the Great Depression, so at the time there was little interest in her work and African American writing in general, as well as little money to go around to spend on literature. The most money she ever earned on a book was a bit less than $1,000. Regardless, though, Hurston wrote and published in a variety of genres: novels, short stories, essays, plays, collections of folklore, and even an autobiography. Sadly, though, in the last years of her life, Hurston returned to Florida and earned money by occasionally working as a maid. She died of a stroke at the age of 69. Her funeral was the result of charity from her neighbors, but they didn't have enough money to pay for a headstone. So for 13 years, Zora Neale Hurston lay in an unmarked grave until Alice Walker, another major African American writer who is still currently alive today, found what was believed to be her grave and borrowed words from another Harlem Renaissance writer, Jean Toomer, to adorn Zora's headstone. And her headstone reads, Zora Neale Hurston, a genius of the South. So we really have Alice Walker in some ways to thank for kind of revitalizing some of this interest in Hurston and bringing her back into the spotlight. So there are a few other biographical details that have a connection to Their Eyes Were Watching God that are worth knowing. So Hurston's first marriage was to Herbert Sheen in 1927, but the two separated from about a year later and eventually were divorced officially. In 1939, she married Albert Price III, then filed for divorce the next year, and then that divorce was also granted a few years later. Eventually, Hurston received a Guggenheim Fellowship to travel to Haiti and Jamaica to study black religious traditions and voodoo. And while she was in Haiti, she actually wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God in 7 weeks. Prior to leaving the country, though, Hurston had been in a relationship with a man 20 years younger than her, and she was in her 40s at the time. The man's name was Percival McGuire Punter, and he was a graduate student with a sharp mind and wit that made him attractive to Zora. The two had a passionate and satisfying relationship. Zora called it the real love affair of her life. Unfortunately, as their relationship developed, Punter wanted Zora to give up her career and marry him, as he thought it would interfere with her role as a wife. Zora would not and could not do this, as she loved her work and Punter equally. One night, the two began exchanging physical blows, and Zora realized she was in too deep. She had developed an obsession for him that was taking control of her life. So Zora does include her feelings for Punter in Their Eyes Were Watching God, but it would be a mistake to fully read Janie and Tea Cake as direct stand-ins for Zora and Punter. And as another sort of detail, the hurricane that occurs in the second half of the novel is based on a hurricane that happened in the Florida Everglades that led to the death of almost 2,000 people. Zora interviewed the survivors of this storm, which is where she might get some of her knowledge and description from, and also lived through a hurricane herself when she was in the Bahamas in 1929. So as we can see, from her own relationship to her experience with hurricanes to setting most of the novel in her hometown, Zora Neale Hurston draws very heavily from her own life to write Their Eyes Were Watching God.